Hi everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we'll talk once more about individuation, but this time we'll talk about the impossibility of individuation. In concrete, we will highlight that wholeness for Carl Jung is an impossible quest. It's a fantasy that keeps perpetuating the otherwise unaccomplishable process of individuation in its final destination as the sort of individuated whole person. Now, we will link this parable we will link this as a parable to the process of marriage that always produces a third. An impossible, out of the impossible discourse, I would say, between the two counterparts of the marriage itself. Now, we will also speak about alchemy in this context. We will speak about the impossibility of the transmutation process. And we will end up speaking about, ultimately, the final driving fantasy of the Jungian quest. That is, if we remember correctly from other videos that I made, the process of individuation is a process that is natural, but cut or prohibited or prevented by the ego's desire for its own sort of tyrannical maintenance, the maintenance of its own tyrannical reign, if you will. Now, the alchemical quest, if you remember, I made some videos on the alchemical quest. If you haven't watched those, go ahead and check them out. But the alchemical quest essentially aims at the transmutation of material into a sort of a more purified material, the purification of a lesser material into ultimately the gold of the alchemists. If you remember, the alchemical quest has never been concluded. That is, the alchemical quest is impossible, in fact, to conclude. It is a quest that is, let's say, as impossible as the process of individuation itself. Now, if you remember, the process of individuation essentially aims to bring about psychological wholeness. That is, to bring the subject into a state in which it is no longer the sort of subject that is only characterized by its subjective trajectories that are put forth by the ego in its sort of narrative body, but instead now characterized by the union of the ego's elements with the sort of the ego's subjective elements with the selves or with the other's non-ego objective elements. Now, if you remember correctly, and we should recall that this process is essentially characterized by a path of integration of material from what Jung referred to as the shadow. The shadow essentially being that which the subject doesn't recognize as its own. That which the ego pushes into the background, that to which the ego says this isn't me, this is not me, right? That's essentially the shadow. It is what Freud in essence called the personal unconscious, right? Or what Freud referred to as the unconscious at all, because for him there was no difference between the personal and the impersonal unconscious, or what Jung called the collective unconscious. Now, the shadow also, as Jung highlights, reaches all the way down to hell, right? What that essentially means is that that the shadow reaches into the collective depths of the societies, but then also ultimately the humanity as a whole that we exist in. Now, it's interesting to reflect on the question whether a shadow is not only a product of creation by the subject, so a product of the ego's creation in that sense, right? And this brings me to this idea of the sort of infinitely perpetuating process of ego creation or of individuation, right? Essentially, like in this mandala that you see, right? The self is essentially in its emergence an infinitely more detailed picture of what it means to be me that can never be sort of grasped in its entirety, right? And the reason I would argue for that is that basically if we think about what integration means. Integration essentially entails you take something and include it in a structure that's already existent, in which a lot of like contents are already included, right? Not the same contents, right? You don't take blue and the same blue again, but you take blue and a shade of blue, right? And both are colors, right? Even if you take blue and red and you mix them, right, you still have two colors that you bring together, right? In alchemy, you still have two materials that you bring together, right? So there is a fundament for interaction, and that interaction produces, I would argue, a third. And this third, again, is something that is not included in the union of the two, right? There's always, if you have a chemical process, if you put two things together, there's always something that comes out of it other than the main material that comes out of it that you then continue working with, right? Let's say there's, as a byproduct, carbon dioxide is produced, right? And that's sort of the third, right? And my argument essentially rests on the grounds that because there is always a third that is produced, you essentially always have something that is not integrated in what you have just created as something new that is sort of supposedly more integrated as what you had before, right? So if you take one material and another material, you essentially produce a third material that is more integrated than the first and the second, simply because it is a mixture of the first and the second. But then out of these two, the synthesis already produces the first new thesis, right, in itself, simply because it produces this byproduct as I just highlighted. And now the point that I wanted to make regarding marriage is, as you will come to see later, that this third product is sort of the child of the first two, right? And essentially, I think what this means for the process of individuation is that there's always something new that emerges when you bring two together, right? And I think I talked about this already a little bit in a video that I made on the object, or on the let's say the sort of the third in Julia Kristeva, right? The object that which cannot be integrated. Now I'm quoting Kristeva incorrectly here probably, but roughly speaking, right? Sort of an appendix in the, again, as you may have noticed, hinting at the Hegelian third, right? But it's always a byproduct of the two, right? And essentially that is, the shadow is always, or continues to exist in its structure, because even integrating elements of the shadow will create a new element of the shadow once again, right? And that is why there's an impossibility of wholeness ultimately. And I would argue that for Jung, wholeness is as much as a fantasy as in Lacan, perhaps the real is a fantasy, right? I don't think there is any way to properly achieve wholeness, as I've argued on many points, and I don't think that wholeness is even the point of individuation. I think there's something else to it, and neither is wholeness the point of the self. The self, I think, I would say is as much as the ego, it's fictional, right? And as much as we have to say that the ego's coherence is a fictional, it's an illusion, right? It's a fictional illusion, which doesn't make sense. It's fictional or an illusion, right? It's an illusion. The self as a whole, right, is also an illusion. And I would say along the same lines, the possibility of marriage as a union in a whole harmony, you may say, right? As a harmonic union, right? This alchemical melting of the two and the marriage of the opposites, right? Ultimately, is also an illusion on the level of the sort of mundane marriage on earth and so on and so forth. Now, that doesn't mean that it isn't something to strive for, to sort of walk the way of the Christ, you may say, the way of the realization of the self, and manifest that in one's marriage, but the marriage always produces an object, just as the process of integration produces an object, because in the end, marriage in itself is simply it's a very deep encounter with otherness on a voluntary level over time for a long duration of time, right? I would say. And right, you go ahead and you say, well, you and I, we're going to allow each other to influence our egos, essentially, on a very fundamental level for a very long time, in order to come closer together, right? But you produce a third, and the third is essentially the child that comes out of, that emerges from the marriage, that comes out of the marriage. And this third is characterized by the impossibility, or the discourse that cannot be integrated, essentially. And this discourse that cannot be integrated is pretty literally, or physically, if you will, what the child ends up standing as, right? The child ends up standing as that which the parents, in their otherness, cannot reconcile, right? And if you think about the formation of the unconscious, now in the Lacanian sense or in the Freudian sense, right, as the personal unconscious, it's literally formed, or it emerges literally in as the kind, and I'm oversimplifying here partly because I'm not a Lacanian Freudian scholar, but it emerges as that which the child cannot, as the discourse of the parents that the child cannot reconcile, if you will. And I think that is precisely the discourse that the parents themselves cannot reconcile, right? The irreconcilable difference, if you will, between two beings that are so different that certain aspects within them cannot melt into one, right? And we see this on a social level as well, right? We see that essentially in the social dialogue, you have certain recurring themes that are pushed out, and then you have certain moments in time where some of these recurring themes that are attempted to be integrated, but then there may be a success, but the success always comes with a price, right? And you see this, I mean, mundanely, you see this in your own life, supposedly, right? You see that where when you exist in your own, and you attempt to grow, you attempt to develop, you attempt to make changes in your life for the better, there's always a trade-off, right? There's always a sacrifice that you end up making. And this sacrifice is essentially akin to the third that comes out of any attempt to integrate, right? But what I would like to highlight to you is that the sacrifice that you make at the same time drives you forward. And the same goes for any sort of relationship to yourself and really, yourself and reality. So the self-development relationship, or in a marriage or a relationship with another sort of friend or partner. The kind of sacrifices that you make in order to move closer to the other, although they cannot, or although it's impossible to come to terms with the other entirely, they nonetheless perpetuate your relationship with them and your relationship with reality as such, I would argue. And since they do perpetuate your relationship with reality as such, I would say that actually it's precisely those moments of interaction that create a third that ultimately bear the entry point to the meaning of life, if you will, right? Because in the end, you have to ask yourself, like, why, and Jung asked this question, I think, quite clearly, why is it that we exist, and what's the meaning of our existence beyond the level of the egos that is beyond sort of this self-feeding monster that the ego essentially becomes, right? This tyrannical hubris monster that we become. And for Jung, the answer was quite clearly that there is a way to break out of this this infinite this infinity of this infinite tyranny of the ego into another kind of tyranny, or into another space that again will be characterized by the tyranny of the ego, but at least breaks it open to some extent. And I think that's essentially what this perpetuating process of individuation is, right? It's not, you're not moving away from the ego, you're not moving out of it, because that would be impossible, but you're moving into a pathway of accepting otherness that continuously breaks down the boundaries of the ego, thus expanding its horizon to some extent. And that, in my opinion, is the wonder of existence, right? Because you're actually able, if you move away from the constraints of the ego, you're actually able to experience yourself in that regard, right? And I think here's the answer of Job becomes interesting for not for the reasons you would usually think, but essentially because God, in the book of Job, what Jung highlights God is that God wanted to make contact with humans because he wanted to be transformed. And part of that is part of the motivation for that, Jung hypothesized, is because the archetypes are essentially blind, right? And if you read God as a metaphor for the archetypes, then God is essentially blind to the reality of the environment. And I've highlighted this on many occasions. And as is the ego, right? The ego itself is also a pure, I would say the ego is a mechanism, right? A mechanism that is sort of like the infinite wheel of time, attempting to keep itself alive, most fundamentally, right? Keeping itself alive in its sort of self-perpetuating notion, right? But then you have a moment where that becomes so detached from reality that it becomes, you would say, mundanely speaking, you would say it becomes bored. But it basically simply what it becomes tyrannical and thus dysfunctional. And out of this dysfunctionality, you want to attempt to bring back a moment of connection to the reality that we speak about. And this moment of connection can only be brought about in a voluntary encounter and in the attempt to wholeness, right? And that's precisely what's going on here. And perhaps that's a good closing point for the video. Thank you all for watching. It was a bit of a meditative video for me as well, like trying to reflect on these aspects. And I hope you like the format. Please leave a like and a comment and let me know if you enjoyed this video, or if you want to hear more on it or less. You can also let me know that you didn't enjoy it. And yeah, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for supporting me.